Professor James Alexander had a moment where all that he knew and thought was turned on its head. All his research, all his studies, all these years of effort, and he was certain that reality didn't exist. It was a moment that would change his life forever. He now found himself having to explain his conclusions to a college board in order to keep his job. Professor Alexander, you're here to explain why you think reality isn't real, and why you've added this to your curriculum to the unease of many students. It was true. Some religious students and some rich alum parents didn't take kindly to his new research and claims. He was maybe a little gung-ho after the publishing of his information and brought it up in class a little too much, but he felt it went along with the course. This felt a little over the top, even for a college nowadays. The board stared at Mr. Alexander, their eyes stern, but he stood up in front of them, confident in his information. I haven't maintained that it's not real, but more that it's not what we think it is. That reality is very different from what we observe and think is real. And what does that mean? One of the members asked. Take a computer. The digital interface of a computer shows us an entire reality that we can engage with and operate. We can drag and drop things on the screen. We can click on icons, open programs, and yet beneath the visual expression of everything that we witness, none of that is what's actually happening. It's all just code being transformed into visual cues that allow us to see things in a certain way and engage with them in certain ways. The same is true with reality. So we're living in the Matrix, one of the members asked. Are we living in a simulation? That's definitely a possibility, more than a possibility. But even if we weren't living in a simulation, our ability to understand reality is still drastically undercut by the fact that we don't observe things as they are, but how our brain processes things. What do you mean? A board member asked. 40% of our body is actually our body. The rest of it is microorganisms and bacteria. And yet we live and experience life like this body is 100% ours. The microbiome in our stomach can alter our mood and mental health, affecting our central nervous system, and yet it's not us. On top of that, our perception of the world is only as accurate as our brain can translate sound waves and bouncing photons. We have no way of ever knowing that what we perceive is actually real, because everything we perceive is only ever happening in our mind. Right now, you may see a room and me talking, but in truth, the words I'm saying are hitting your ears in waves, and your brain is processing those waves and giving meaning to the words. Your brain is processing the photons that are bouncing off of everything, and they're entering your retina, and your brain fills in the information from there. Though I'm standing in front of you and my feet are on the ground, my feet are not actually touching the ground. The electrons on the ground are pushing against my electrons, thus it looks like I'm standing on the ground, but I'm not. We are made of quintillions of atoms, vibrating and moving. We're mostly empty space, and yet somehow things don't pass through us, and we don't pass through objects, and we see things as solid and whole. Our consciousness seems to be nothing more than electrical signals in the brain, and our left hemisphere creating a narrative around what's happening based on our past experiences, ideas, beliefs, and stories that we tell ourselves. So I ask you, what is real? The members of the board spoke amongst themselves in hushed tones for a little while. When they parted, one of the members began to speak. All you have shown is the complexity of reality, an underlying function of reality. Hardly the evidence needed to show that reality isn't real at all. Certainly that doesn't mean that all these things don't come together to create the reality that we live, the world that we experience. Thus, we have evolved to see the world this way so we can better interact with it. Wouldn't that be fair to say? It would be fair to say. Just like our nervous system reacts to a bristling movement in a bush as it could be a threat, so to better protect us from threats, that we then form this view of reality that we engage with as a matter of survival. But that doesn't make reality any more real than a magician making something disappear. What you see happening only matters if it's what's actually happening. Because if what's happening isn't real, if there's an underlying thing to it, if it's not what we perceive, then are we responding accurately? Are we even making any free choices? And if we're not, which I don't think we are, then what is happening? Certainly you're not going to add on to the idea that we don't have free will. What defines free will? If it's the ability to do something different in the face of the exact same problems and circumstances, with all the same knowledge and information, with the exact same genetics and experiences, then no, how could we possibly have free will? What free will do we possibly have? Neuroscientists have time and again shown us that our brains make decisions long before we're consciously aware of those decisions. Our brains will invent reasons and stories for things, filling in blanks, creating memories out of whole cloth. So if we can't trust what we think, if we can't trust what we see, if we can't trust our reasoning for doing something, then how possibly can we say that what we do was our own free action? So you're just dismissing the thoughts and feelings that every person has before and after they make a decision? This may work for split-second decisions, but what about the things that people think about? What about the things people actually weigh the pros and cons of? You don't escape the very nature of identity and experience and genetics that you have. How your brain has taken in all the experiences and information you've ever encountered, what you think you want, what you're willing to do for it. All of these things are hardwired, based on things completely out of your control. Thus, what you think is a free choice is actually a product of thousands of things you have no control over and your brain trying to make up for it. If you believe that, then what do you think we should do with criminals? Should we just let them all go since the justice system is all about free choices that we have? The board member asked and laughed. Though this is beyond my scope, they should be cared for, removed from society until they are rehabilitated, if they can be rehabilitated. The fact that we spend our entire time creating horrible places and punishing people instead of helping them, turning the very act of addiction into a crime, speaks to an entire misunderstanding of freedom and will and responsibility. So what is the point? Are you saying that we're just automatons moving about playing a story in the universe's mind? Not at all. I don't think the you that you think is you is real at all. But there is something there. The thing that hears your thoughts. The thing that looks at you and all the pieces that make you up. Whether you want to call it conscious agent or you want to call it some sort of awareness, it seems shared by everyone, this watcher or observer. The soul, the board member asked. If one wants to say that, then certainly. But what I'm saying is that there is enough evidence to suggest that we are not who we think we are, and every culture seems to identify the notion of something else within us that goes beyond the physical form. So to get this all straight, you're saying that what we perceive isn't what is real. That physics and neuroscience reveals that our ability to process and understand the world is more about interpretation than actually seeing what is there. That the brain itself is kind of a slave to everything it's previously learned and experienced, and that it makes its decisions on these principles. And thus, with all of that, this reality isn't real. That is what I'm saying. That doesn't mean that we don't experience the world. That doesn't mean that we aren't seeing anything. It doesn't mean that people must cease living. In fact, it's probably impossible for people to not do what they're going to do. It simply means that reality isn't what we think it is. It's an illusion. It's a trick of the mind. The world that we are experiencing is always forming in front of us, taking shape, becoming what it will become. And there's a great freedom to that. An understanding that we are not this. We aren't our mistakes. We aren't our victories. We're not the good or the evil that we do. We're the entirety of the universe experiencing itself, gloriously and amazingly, and putting on the greatest show ever seen. At least that's how I like to think about it. And that's what I was sharing. The board mumbled amongst themselves once more. They spoke and nodded, and Professor Alexander stood there and waited. Then the man who had previously stood up stood back up. We'll deliberate and let you know our decision by the end of the day. Professor Alexander left, neither feeling victorious nor sad, just calm, as he had been through the entirety of the process. Things didn't feel the same anymore since he realized this truth. Good or bad, right or wrong, none of these meant anything. Everything just was. Everything was perfect. Regardless of what happens, life would unfold as life unfolds.